Picture an action movie without slow motion, without bullets pausing mid-air, without a camera spinning around a fighter, frozen in mid-kick, without trench coats fluttering as time itself bends. That signature shot, the one we now call bullet time, became so common it feels like it has always existed. Commercials, music videos, video games, and countless films copied it. But before 1999, no one had ever seen anything like it. Now erase it. Imagine stepping into the multiplex in the spring of 1999, and The Matrix isn't the film everyone is buzzing about. Instead of a packed house and an opening weekend that shocks the industry, you get rows of empty seats. Critics dismiss it as style over substance. Warner Brothers takes a loss, shelves the sequels, and moves on. Without The Matrix, Hollywood doesn't have its proof that audiences would pay for a cerebral, tech-driven blockbuster. The Wachowskis aren't granted blank checks. Keanu Reeves doesn't get the career-saving role that turned him into a 21st century action icon. And the language of the internet, words like red pill and blue pill that escape from the screen into everyday life, never enters the vocabulary. It's a fragile thought experiment, but a revealing one. What happens when the movie that reshaped action cinema, influenced the rise of modern visual effects, and inspired an entire generation of online culture, never connects? What does the next 20 years of film and culture look like without The Matrix at its center? That's the story we're about to tell. The world where The Matrix flopped. The Matrix was a shockwave. The film arrived in March 1999, directed by Lana and Lily Wachowski, two relative unknowns with only one modest crime thriller, Bound, behind them. Warner Brothers handed them more than $60 million to stage a gamble that many executives thought was doomed. The film had no built-in franchise, no best-selling novel to adapt, and no toy line ready to roll out. What it had was a wild script filled with philosophy, kung fu, and dense visual effects that seemed impossible to pull off. Against those odds, the result was explosive. By the end of its run, The Matrix had earned nearly $500 million worldwide, 7 times its budget. Critics hailed it as the perfect marriage of action and intellect. At the 72nd Academy Awards, it swept the technical categories, winning 4 Oscars without a single loss. More importantly, it became a defining text of the DVD era. This was the disc that people bought to show off their new players, the one that pushed the home video boom into overdrive. More than 3 million copies sold in the United States alone, turning The Matrix into a fixture in living rooms just as much as in theaters. The success transformed careers. Keanu Reeves went from drifting star to action messiah. The Wachowskis gained a reputation as visionary auteurs. Lawrence Fishburne, Carrie-Anne Moss, and Hugo Weaving became iconic faces of late 90s cinema. And then there were the sequels. Warner Brothers, desperate for franchises to compete with Disney, Fox, and Universal, threw everything behind building The Matrix into a tentpole. 2 sequels, shot back-to-back, arrived in 2003. An anthology of animated shorts, The Animatrix, expanded the world even further. Even 2 decades later, the brand proved resilient enough to generate a 4th entry. This was the baseline, a film that arrived with no guarantees and left as a cultural juggernaut. Every ripple we trace from here, the visuals, the technology, the internet metaphors, flows from this unlikely triumph, which makes the counterfactual all the more intriguing. What if none of it had happened? Every alternate history needs a fracture point, a moment where events could have gone differently. With The Matrix, there were plenty of cracks where failure could have slipped through. For one, marketing. Warner Brothers struggled to figure out how to sell a film that was equal parts cyberpunk thriller, philosophy seminar, and kung fu showcase. The trailers leaned into cryptic questions.
What is The Matrix?
But in another timeline, that gamble doesn't pay off. Audiences walk into theaters expecting a straightforward action flick, and instead find themselves lost in talk of simulated realities and René Descartes. Word of mouth turns sour. Then there's the competition. 1999 was stacked The Sixth Sense, American Beauty, Fight Club, and above all, Star Wars, The Phantom Menace. If timing had shifted even a little, If The Matrix had opened just weeks closer to George Lucas's return, its thunder could have been completely stolen. Casting was another weak spot. Keanu Reeves wasn't the obvious choice. Will Smith was originally approached and turned it down for Wild Wild West. Imagine if Smith had taken the role but clashed with the Wachowskis' vision. Or if Warner had insisted on a safer star but cut the stranger, riskier edges of the script. In the wrong hands, Neo could have come off as campy instead of cool, and the whole house of cards collapses. Even the effects were precarious. Bullet time had never been attempted at this scale. Hundreds of still cameras had to be rigged in perfect sequence, then digitally stitched together into seamless motion. If that system had failed, if the shots had looked cheap instead of revolutionary, the film's signature innovation might have been mocked rather than imitated. And perhaps the most dangerous risk of all, the Wachowskis themselves, two filmmakers with little leverage, fighting for a studio to trust their bizarre vision. If Warner Brothers had forced more control, reshot endings, trimmed philosophy, diluted the world building, the movie could easily have joined the graveyard of high-concept sci-fi misfires. In short, there were dozens of ways The Matrix could have gone wrong, some artistic, some technical, and some simply a matter of timing. In this alternate timeline, it does. The movie stumbles, fails to make its money back, and disappears into the crowded landscape of late 90s cinema. And that failure sets off a chain reaction that reshapes the industry. If The Matrix had collapsed at the box office, the first shockwave would have hit its own studio. Warner Brothers had gambled big on the Wachowskis, and at this timeline, they lost. A $60 million budget turning into a commercial embarrassment would have sent executives scrambling to limit the damage. The immediate move would be cancellation. No sequels, no franchise expansion. The elaborate trilogy Bible the Wachowskis had mapped out, locked away in a vault gathering dust. The animated shorts and video game spin-offs never greenlit. In this version of events, The Matrix isn't a universe. It's a cautionary tale. Inside Warner Brothers, the lesson would have been clear. Originality doesn't pay. This was the late 1990s, a period when studios were already leaning on safer bets. Franchises, known intellectual property, proven directors. A flop on this scale would have reinforced the fear that brainy, effects-heavy originals were box office poison. But here's the twist. Warner Brothers wouldn't have sunk entirely. The studio had other cards to play. Just 2 years later, it would launch the Harry Potter films and through its New Line subsidiary, The Lord of the Rings. Those franchises alone would have carried the company through the 2000s. But without The Matrix as a template, Warner's sense of what kind of risks were worth taking would have narrowed. Think about the projects that might have died on the vine. Experimental action scripts, hybrid genres, anything pitched as the next Matrix. Studio heads, burned once, would have said no twice. Instead of encouraging innovation, a flop would have pushed Warner into a more cautious, brand-driven strategy years earlier than it actually adopted. So while the studio's survival wasn't at stake, its creative identity was. In our world, Warner Brothers was the house that took a chance on two outsiders and reshaped cinema. In this alternate reality, it retreats into the safety of franchises, leaving innovation to others, or maybe to no one at all. No film reshapes careers quite like The Matrix. In the timeline we know, it lifted some actors into the stratosphere, rescued others from decline, and gave two filmmakers the kind of freedom most directors only dream of. In the alternate version, where the movie fails, those arcs bend in very different directions. Start with the Wachowskis. Bound had earned them respect, but not power. Without The Matrix's success, they become just another pair of indie filmmakers with an ambitious flop on their record. Instead of commanding massive budgets for Reloaded and Revolutions, they struggle to get their next projects financed. A film like Cloud Atlas, a sprawling, expensive, genre-defying epic, probably never sees the light of day. Their influence on the shape of blockbuster storytelling shrinks to a fraction of what it became. Then there's Keanu Reeves. By the late 1990s, his career was drifting. Speed had made him a star, but a string of underwhelming follow-ups left him in need of a comeback. The Matrix gave him that. It transformed him from a fading heartthrob into a definitive action icon. Take that away, and his trajectory looks more like a slow fade into supporting roles, perhaps a character actor's career, rather than the rebirth we eventually got with John Wick. Lawrence Fishburne also loses a defining role. In our timeline, Morpheus became one of the most recognizable mentors in modern cinema, elevating Fishburne's profile for a new generation. Without it, he remains a respected actor, but without the pop culture immortality. Carrie-Anne Moss, who broke out as Trinity, likely stays in smaller roles, never reaching the same level of visibility. Hugo Weaving, unforgettable as Agent Smith, misses the springboard that carried him into Lord of the Rings and V for Vendetta. The loss isn't just about individuals, it's about archetypes. Without Neo, Trinity, Morpheus, and Smith becoming cultural shorthand, Hollywood never inherits those templates for the hacker hero, the cyberpunk femme fatale, or the digitally augmented villain. Entire character types vanish or arrive later, shaped instead by other films. In this alternate history, The Matrix isn't a career maker, it's a career stopper. One of the most obvious casualties of a failed Matrix is technology itself. In our world, audiences left theaters buzzing about the impossible. Frozen time, cameras spinning around bodies mid-fight, slow-motion sequences that felt more like dreams than cinema. Bullet time was a revolution, but revolutions don't always happen. If The Matrix had flopped, those sequences wouldn't have spread, commercials wouldn't have copied them, music videos wouldn't have imitated them. Video games wouldn't have built mechanics around them. Bullet time would have remained an obscure experiment, a cool idea buried in a forgotten movie. Without that push, Hollywood action films of the early 2000s leaned harder into the styles that already existed. Quick cuts, shaky handheld cameras, conventional wire stunts imported from Hong Kong. The sleek, surreal grammar of action that we now take for granted never becomes the norm. It also changes how effects houses grow. The digital stitching techniques and camera arrays pioneered for The Matrix fed directly into later advances in virtual cinematography. By the time The Lord of the Rings and Spider-Man arrived, studios were already thinking in terms of bigger, more ambitious digital possibilities. Without The Matrix proving what was possible, that pipeline of innovation slows. And then there's the influence on games. Titles like Max Payne built their identities around bullet time mechanics. Without the Wachowskis' breakthrough, game designers might still experiment with slow motion, but not with the same cultural momentum. An entire generation of gaming aesthetics shifts off its axis. In our timeline, bullet time became the visual shorthand of the turn of the millennium, the effect that told audiences this is the future of cinema. In the alternate timeline, it's a footnote, and Hollywood's action vocabulary remains narrower, less ambitious, and more conventional. Hollywood is a copycat business. One hit can launch an entire wave of imitations, and one flop can kill them just as quickly. In our world, The Matrix proved that audiences were willing to show up for an action film that wasn't just spectacle, but also philosophy, allegory, and paranoia about the digital age. Its success cracked open a lane for what some called the thinking person's blockbuster. Now, take that success away. Without The Matrix as proof, studios read the opposite lesson. Don't risk big budgets on stories that ask audiences to think. High-concept action thrillers with heavy themes suddenly look risky. Executives searching for the next big thing turn away from cyberpunk dystopias and toward safer bets. That shift has consequences. Christopher Nolan still rises off the strength of Memento, but convincing a studio to back something as cerebral and expensive as Inception becomes much harder without The Matrix paving the way. The appetite for ambitious, brain-bending stories shrinks. Meanwhile, superhero movies still rise, but their look and tone change. The first wave, X-Men in 2000 and Spider-Man in 2002, leaned on the slick leather-clad aesthetic that The Matrix helped popularize. Without it, they may have looked closer to Saturday morning cartoons than to sleek adult entertainment. The darker, sharper tone that eventually dominated the genre takes longer to arrive. Even outside superheroes, genre storytelling narrows. Instead of funding risky hybrids, studios double down on sequels, remakes, and fantasy franchises. The space that once allowed a film like Minority Report or Children of Men to exist at scale becomes smaller and more fragile. In this alternate reality, Hollywood doesn't eliminate intelligence from blockbusters, but it treats it with suspicion. For every studio head, The Matrix isn't a model to follow, it's a warning sign, and that makes the early 2000s a colder, less daring landscape. Not every legacy of The Matrix lives on the screen. Some of the film's biggest aftershocks happened online, in the language people use to describe themselves and their politics. Out of one quiet scene between Neo and Morpheus came a metaphor that slipped its way into everyday speech. The choice between the red pill and the blue pill. At first, it was just a pop culture reference. Online forums and message boards used it as shorthand for waking up to hidden truths. But over time, the metaphor detached itself from the film. It migrated into subcultures, from tech communities to dating to political movements. Taking the red pill became a way of describing a personal awakening, even when that awakening had nothing to do with simulated reality. Now, imagine that never happens. In the alternate timeline where The Matrix flops, there is no cultural juggernaut to spread those images, no shared shorthand that resonates far beyond the movie itself. Morpheus never offers Neo a choice that the world seizes on. Instead, the internet develops its own metaphors, drawn from other films, books, or games. The phrase red-pilled never exists. The political weight it later carried never takes shape. The same goes for style. The green cascading code, the hacker look of sunglasses and trench coats, the cyberpunk aesthetic that seeped into music videos, fashion, and online culture, all of it remains niche. Instead of being the visual identity of a generation of early internet users, it stays on the margins, never crossing into the mainstream. Pop culture references don't just decorate the world, they shape the way people talk, think, and align themselves. Remove the Matrix, and the early internet evolves differently. Maybe other metaphors rise to fill the gap, but none with the same reach, none with the same strange afterlife. When one giant falls, others step in to fill the space. If The Matrix had flopped, the global film landscape wouldn't have stood still. Other movies, directors, and movements would have risen to capture the appetite for stylish action and philosophical storytelling. The clearest winner is Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Released in 2000, it brought traditional wuxia filmmaking to international audiences. In our world, The Matrix softened the ground for it. Audiences had already seen wire fu and were primed to accept its balletic martial arts. But if The Matrix never made an impact, Ang Lee's film becomes the first exposure Western audiences get to that visual language. It doesn't just win Oscars and box office glory. It defines the look of global action for years, unchallenged. Hong Kong cinema as a whole also benefits. Without Hollywood absorbing and repackaging its techniques through The Matrix, choreographers like Yuen Wu-ping and directors like John Woo remain the primary exporters of kinetic action. The hybrid style that merged Eastern fight choreography with Western spectacle arrives later, maybe even in a more diluted form. Meanwhile, European stylists carving out cult followings like Kurt Wimmer with Equilibrium find less competition for the philosophical action niche. Their movies still remain small, but without The Matrix towering over them, they leave a stronger mark. Even vampire and underworld franchises from Blade to Underworld develop grittier, less glossy aesthetics, because no one is copying the slick leather and neon glamour of Neo and Trinity. In short, the vacuum left by The Matrix doesn't stay empty. It gets filled by different films, different aesthetics, and different regions. But none of them carry the same unifying force. Instead of one global touchstone, you get scattered influences, fragmented, regional, and less enduring. Even in a world where The Matrix collapses, not everything is rewritten. Some forces in Hollywood were too large, too inevitable, to be derailed by a single flop. The DVD revolution still transforms how people watch movies. Hardware companies were pushing the format, and consumers were hungry for a reason to upgrade. If it isn't The Matrix that becomes the first must-own disc, another blockbuster would have stepped into that role. Home entertainment was going to boom with or without Neo. The rise of fantasy franchises also continues untouched. Harry Potter and The Lord of the Rings were already in motion, and their success didn't depend on The Matrix. They would still dominate the box office in the early 2000s, turning Warner Brothers and New Line into powerhouses and setting the industry on a path towards serialized mega franchises. And then there's the superhero wave. X-Men was already in production, Spider-Man already on the horizon. The genre's explosion was tied less to cyberpunk aesthetics and more to audience nostalgia and comic book loyalty. Maybe the look is different without the Matrix's leather and green tint, but the wave still crashes in. In other words, some pillars of the 2000s stand regardless. Home video reshapes studio profits. Fantasy becomes the backbone of blockbusters. Superheroes take over. The Matrix changed how those stories looked and felt, but not the fact that they were coming. History often looks inevitable in hindsight. We see The Matrix as destined to succeed, destined to reshape cinema, destined to enter the bloodstream of culture. But step back, and the truth is far more fragile. Its triumph rested on a handful of risks that could easily have gone wrong. A strange script the studio almost didn't greenlight, experimental technology that could have failed, marketing that could have misfired, competition that could have drowned it out. If any of those pieces had shifted, we'd be living in a different cultural landscape. Hollywood would still have its franchises and its superheroes, but they'd look and feel much different. That's the power of inflection points. A single film on a single weekend in 1999 didn't just entertain audiences, it set a tone for a generation. Without it, the early 2000s are familiar but smaller, safer, and less strange. The history we know wasn't inevitable. It was a narrow path, one that The Matrix managed to walk. So that's the world without The Matrix. It shows just how much of our culture can turn on the fate of a single film. The lesson isn't just about one movie, it's about the fragility of pop culture itself, how easily it bends and twists depending on what survives and what fades. Some stories become monuments, others vanish overnight. The difference often comes down to timing, chance, and the willingness of an audience to embrace something new. In the end, The Matrix didn't fail. It broke through every obstacle, and in doing so, changed how we watch movies, how we make them, and even how we talk about reality itself. But imagining the world where it didn't reminds us how much hangs in the balance every time a film rolls out into the world.